Well, welcome everyone to what is our third already Employment Support Scotland Forum of the Year, early March. Congratulations for making it, not only to the month of March, but to the end of the week. I think we're all doing pretty well to navigate life at the moment, given that we're coming up on the first anniversary of having to work from home for a couple of weeks, which seems like quite a long time ago. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Duplett and I'm the chair of Employment Support Scotland. I'm also a board member, or probably a trustee, I think it is now, Elizabeth, of ERSA. And my day job is I work for an organisation called Triage, and we deliver employability and education programmes mostly across Scotland, but well, predominantly across Scotland and the northeast of England. I've kind of been in this area for a number of years, so I hopefully know most folk, or if I don't, I'll get to know you fairly soon. I'm joined today by Robin Turner, who's our Vice Chair. Again, if you don't know me, you'll know Robin, I'm sure. Robin is the Chief Executive of Routes to Work, a well-known Lanarkshire-based employability provider, and also Elizabeth Taylor, who's the Chief Executive of ERSA. I'll very quickly run through what the agenda is and then we'll just get going if that's okay. We don't have a hugely big group today, which is good. That means that it's going to be dead easy for you all to contribute and chip in with questions and queries, and you're not going to have to worry about being a voice in a big crowd. So first up, we are going to have a session from Phil Aglenook. I hope you've pronounced your name correctly there, Phil, from Untitled Chapter. So Phil is going to give us a bit of an insight into some of the key points that came out of the recent UK government budget, particularly around about universal credit and the Scottish Child Payment. We're then going to move on to an update on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Some of you will be familiar with that policy development and upcoming programme, and will know that there were some announcements recently on how the UK government intends to pilot that activity, and Elizabeth is going to talk us through that. We're then going to do a brief revisit of the Network of Networks piece of work, which some of you will be familiar with if you've been on previous calls. I'm going to lead on that and share or reshare some of the key recommendations, and then what we want to try and do is get a bit of insight from the group on what do we want to do with this as Employment Support Scotland. And we'll then move on to kind of the final bits, which is just generally what we want to be doing in our upcoming meetings. We've got meetings scheduled for the rest of the year, and we want to try and make sure that those meetings best reflect the needs and the desires of folk who are part of the membership and give their time to come along here. So we'll hopefully have an opportunity to talk about that. So that should hopefully take us up to midday. It won't take us any longer than that. We may get a bit of time back. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Phil. Hopefully your tethering phone connection will hold out for us. And are you going to share some slides, Phil, or are you just going to talk?
No, I'm going to be very brief, Paul, which is probably very lucky because I'm not sure if my internet will hold up. So if you can't hear me, do just say. No, I'm just going to mention a couple of things on the budget and then just talk a little bit about Scottish benefits, but I doubt I'll be more than 5 minutes. So the main thing about the budget from a benefits point of view was the extension to the uplift in universal credit, which came in just about a year ago in April 20, and it went for a whole year until now and has now been extended until September 21. I'm just going to stop and just check that you can actually hear me. Laura, do send me a message if you can't hear me because my screen has frozen. So it's been extended for 6 months. And I think the main thing I want to say about that is the government say it's 6 months and it is going to be down in the finance bill as 6 months. However, historically, when the government have tried to reduce the amount of money that people receive in their pockets, they haven't gone through with that. And the best example of that is in 2015, when George Osborne tried to cut tax credits, and as part of the various welfare reforms made then, there was going to be a cut in the actual amount of money people received in their pocket. And George Osborne didn't follow through on that policy following a rebellion in the Commons. And I think there's a reasonable chance that the same will happen again in relation to universal credit. In general, governments can and do cut benefits through freezing them, and they can and do cut benefits for new entrants, but it's very rare for government to actually reduce the amount of money in people's pockets. So we'll have to wait and see. But the way it is at the moment is that come October, people on universal credit who all have an extra £20 relative to what it would have been a week, will see that go down. We'll see that go down to its previous level. Okay, but as you can detect, I'm quite dubious about whether that will actually happen. And indeed, it's worth noting that Joe Biden's just done the precise reverse in America and had a massive increase in the incomes for the lowest paid and low income households. So both in terms of the politics of it and in terms of the international climate, in terms of the response to the pandemic, we will see. I've expressed my doubt as to whether it will actually happen. Okay, but the key thing to remember about that £20 is it only applies to people who are on universal credit. If you're on what are called legacy benefits, you only get it if you are in work or were in work immediately prior to the pandemic and qualify for something called working tax credit. And what that means is that for lots of people, they would be better off under universal credit than they would on their legacy benefits. And that was true anyway. The situation before the £20 uplift was that roughly half of people on what are called legacy benefits would have been better off under universal credit, and about half are better off staying where they are. The introduction of that £20 uplift has changed that balance so that they're going to be relatively more people who are going to be better off under universal credit. Now, of course, because the uplift only lasts until October, or is only meant to last until October, whether people actually will make any changes, will voluntarily move across to universal credit, is completely unknown. But in terms of people who you're helping, people who are on legacy benefits, so that's job seekers allowance, income support, employment support allowance, and tax credits, it is worth checking to see whether they're better off under universal credit. There are lots of disadvantages to universal credit, but for some people, and particularly I'd highlight tenants, low earning employed tenants, they can be better off under universal credit, even ignoring the £20 uplift. I'll move on to self-employed people, because self-employed people are the big exception to that. If you're self-employed in universal credit, there's something called the minimum income floor. That doesn't exist in tax credits. In tax credits, you can report your income, and if you have a very low income from self-employment, you continue to get help through tax credits. Under the minimum income floor, the government assumes that you are going to be earning typically 35 hours a week at the minimum wage. So that's for someone who's not disabled and doesn't have a reduced amount of hours, that's about £1,200 a month. And even if you're not earning that amount, they assume that you are and reduce your universal credit accordingly. The minimum income floor was suspended during the pandemic, and it was suspended until the end of April. That extension has now come until the end of July. So the minimum income floor won't begin to affect people until August. But when it does affect people, and again, it will affect people not all in one go. There are complicated rules around grace periods and when you joined universal credit, which will affect when it affects individuals. But when the minimum income floor does kick in, it will mean that even if you're earning under £1,200 a week, they will assume that £1,200 a month, sorry. They will assume that you are, and that will cause your universal credit to go down. So looking forward to the restart programme, I think one of the key things will be to get across to individuals how the minimum income floor works, and if they are looking at self-employment, to explain that they need to make sure that they can earn £1,200 a month in order for it to make sense. If not, they are better off going down the employee route where you don't have a minimum income floor. So if you've got, say, if you can only find 15 hours a week or 20 hours a week of work, you're not penalised for that if you're an employee. You are penalised for that if you're self-employed. So the government, there was a chance they were going to abolish the minimum income floor. They haven't done that. They've delayed its introduction until the end of July. And I do expect that timetable to be kept in terms of the minimum income floor. Okay, so those were the two main things in the budget. And I'm just going to highlight one other thing while my Wi-Fi holds up, if it is holding up, which is that last month the Scottish Child Payment began. The Scottish Child Payment at the moment is £10 a week payment per child if the child is under 6. So only families with children under 6 receive the payment. And in order to qualify for the payment, you've got to be on benefits, or either tax credits, one of the legacy benefits, or universal credit. And if you come off the end of those benefits, so if your earnings rise above the point where you qualify for universal credit, you lose entitlement to Scottish Child Payment. So the important thing in terms of looking at benefits is that it creates a cliff edge, so that just as if you go above a certain amount of earnings, £7,200, you lose free school meals. If you earn above the amount where you qualify for universal credit, you will lose entitlement to the Scottish Child Payment. So there will be a small group of people who will find that earning a little bit less, keeping a little bit of qualification for universal credit and keeping their Scottish Child Payment is the more sensible route than earning a little bit more, no longer having any entitlement to universal credit and losing entitlement to the Scottish Child Payment. So I don't think that's a big effect at the moment, because the Scottish Child Payment only goes to households where there's a child under 6. But from next year, the ambition is to roll that out to all households where there's a child under 16. And I think at that point, it will be worth thinking about that effect a bit more. I would say this: you can find out about all these things in our calculator. It will work out all these things automatically. The bigger, very long-term thing is, of course, if there is an independence referendum, which is about creating its own Scottish social security system. But even without independence, it's a devolved matter, and the Scottish government are increasingly creating different benefits up in Scotland. So, for instance, they've just created a pandemic support payment, which everyone who qualifies for a benefit called council tax deduction gets £200, or if you qualify for free school meals, I think you also qualify for £120. So that's just a one-off payment associated with the pandemic, but it does illustrate the Scottish government's desire to sort of proactively use the social security system in a way that really isn't the case in terms of the Department for Work and Pensions. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Hope that my internet held up during that, and hand back to you, Paul. And if anyone's got any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
That's brilliant, Phil. Thank you very much. I don't know about anyone else. I heard all of that crystal clear, so Well done, your internet connection on that. It's done a great job. That was really useful. I think just reflecting back on some of the things you've said there, Phil, I suppose the first observation for me is that probably about 10 years ago, I could have done very accurate off-benefit calculations for participants in programmes using obviously the technology that was available at the time. But it strikes me that, you know, one of the main ambitions of things like UC was to simplify the environment. My God, it doesn't seem like a very simple environment at this point in time. It's kind of increasingly convoluted and complicated. And the one thing that it did seek to do, and it's been largely successful in doing, is to remove cliff edges. And it is a bit concerning, I suppose, to some extent that very well-intentioned, devolved additions that sit on top of that. That one of the things that it strikes me that we need to try and do is make sure that we find a way of achieving the policy intent of things like the Scottish Shell payment, but without creating cliff edges, because that is, you know, that's a very unhelpful thing to have in place for anyone, where they have to think about working less in order to be better off. That just seems a very kind of crazy set of circumstances. I had one question as well as some observations, if that's okay, and then I'll open up to others. The minimum income floor kind of issue around people who are self-employed. Is there any kind of meaningful data around that would articulate, firstly, how many people the minimum income floor affects, and secondly, how many people are in that position where they aren't earning the equivalent of the national minimum wage for 35 hours a week, and therefore they are worse off on this? Is there anything that you're aware of in terms of what the data is saying on that?
I'm afraid I haven't got any solid data on it, but I can say that it's not a trivial issue in terms of working tax credit. So in working tax credit, we know that there are, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but it was a substantial minority who had very low earnings under working tax credit, and DWP would classify that as a lifestyle business. So people who have set up, making things at home, and very explicitly DWP's intention is to stop people having lifestyle businesses. So it's a way of preventing that. So I can't give you numbers on it, but certainly it was a big enough issue for DWP to bring in the minimum income floor, and its intention is to put people off that lifestyle business approach. Just briefly on your previous comment about the cliff edge introduced by the Scottish Child Payment, unless universal credit is fully devolved, it's not possible to avoid it. The only way that you can avoid it is if universal credit for families with children in Scotland were made more generous than in the rest of the UK. And the only way to do that would be to fully devolve universal credit to DWP, which isn't allowed under the current devolution legislation. Whether it will be in the future depends a bit, I suppose, on what happens in the election and whether there's a referendum.
Yeah, I think that's it's a level of complication probably too far for us at this point in time. The minimum income floor thing, I suppose that one of the kind of, I suppose, products of that, if you want to call it that we've seen, not in Scotland, because we have the employment programmes we have in Scotland don't rely on earnings, but in England they do, because they use the off-benefit, the real-time earnings system to determine whether or not people have as a proxy for people having been in employment. But one of the things that anyone that's worked in the work and health programme south of the border will be acutely aware of is the minuscule number of people who've gone through that programme, who've then went on to set up as being self-employed, and then who have been successfully claimed as an outcome because of that very issue. It's not necessarily all lifestyle businesses, but the reality of it is that when people start being self-employed, to go straight from a position where you're not trading to a position where you're above that minimum income floor threshold and above that for a period of time until you earn that amount of money is very challenging. And I think I'm fairly certain that DWP's policy intent when they commissioned the Work and Health programme was that probably around about 10 to 15% of the outcomes that were achieved from that would be people who are self-employed. My company run Work and Health programme in the northeast of England. it's less than 1% of outcomes. And I think, you know, that does have an impact on individuals, because, you know, you're having to change people's mindset and people's behaviour around the help that they're going to get going forward, and how financially stable the world of self-employment is likely to be in comparison to what it was in previous programmes. So it is a very interesting area, I think. Are there any other questions that anyone has, or observations for Phil on anything that came up there? If so, please raise your hand, or just jump in. To be honest, there's not that many of us on the call. I'm sure we won't get any interference. Nope. 3, 2, 1. And you're gone, Phil. Well done. You've managed to make it. You've managed to make it with just my questions. Right. Phil, thank you very much for that. That was really useful and really informative, and a lot of food for thought there in terms of some of the opportunities and challenges ahead. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Good. Okay. So Elizabeth, we're moving on to you now. I think you're going to give us a recap on where we're at with UKSPF and what that might mean going forward.
Yeah, and I will just share some slides, which is why I end up keep sharing my whole damn screen. Here we go. You'd think I'd have learned this trick by now. I've been doing it for nearly 12 months, but hey, here we go. If you could just bear with me. So, in the budget, I won't say last week, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, there was the announcement about the Community Renewal Fund, which is 220 million, 1 year pilot. I'll come back to whether it's really 1 year, acting as a bridge to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and it's going to support projects totaling £3 million per local authority, and we'll look at the Scottish places that have been picked in the top 100 in a minute. People will probably be aware that URSA has been working on whatever would follow European funding for employment support since the word Brexit was ever first mentioned. So this announcement for us was much awaited. And of course, what we're really trying to do is find out what's going to happen to the ESF reserves, because people keep saying, and I quote, there is still money slushing around the system. Well, I say, show us the money then. So but there are going to be the pilots, and we will in due course see a prospectus for what the future Shared Prosperity Fund will look like. There's been a lot of talk of what are they trying to achieve from the pilots? Because in actual fact, if they're trying to learn, there have been many lessons learned from European delivery over the years. And in fact, last Monday, URSA and 21 members had a roundtable discussion with the DWP leads on what good would look like with the Shared Prosperity Fund. And certainly I think that there's a lot of knowledge and learning in the sector. So we're going to keep sort of knocking on that door. So, move on. So it's going to be, the pilots are going to be a competitive process across all places in Great Britain, and it's all 4 nations. And it will be managed by what they're calling lead authorities. Lead authorities, very common jargon in the old world of ESF. And as you can see, what they are referencing as lead authorities are in the UK, the Mayoral Combined Authorities, London, County Councils and Unity authorities everywhere else. So this Community Renewal Fund, which is the Shared Prosperity Pilots, it's going to be 90% revenue funding, 10% capital, and there's 4 investment priorities. So I think in terms of our sector, the main interest will be around skills and supporting people into employment. But of course, when we've just talked about supporting entrepreneurs, there is the whole stream of local businesses and communities in place, because regeneration's our world as well. So I'm sure that every one of these 4 investment priorities are really of interest to the employment support sector. And given that, I'll come on to it in a minute, that there's a very tight timeline, I think it's quite important that people interested in participating in a pilot start thinking as of now, because you need to be making local connections and getting in there. So what they're trying to do is ensure a smooth transition between European funding and the shared prosperity. They want to see some innovation through the pilots. They want to see a new and more direct way of working between the government and places, and that reference to the levelling up agenda and creating opportunity and building capacity. So they've identified 100 priority places from an index of economic resilience. I'm told that we are going to see the metrics and what they base these 100 priority places on, because I'm sure people will be aware that there's been some controversy about how these 100 places were chosen. It's worth noting that it's a different prioritisation than they use for the Levelling Up Fund. So there's sort of two lists that people are questioning at the moment, but there is a list of a top 100, and I've pulled out the 13 that I recognised as being in Scotland, so we'll look at those in a minute. It's worth saying that the prospectus doesn't rule out bids from other places other than the top 100, but if you're outside the top 100, you are going to have to score really highly. And a question I asked yesterday of the DWP, although this is straddling the DWP and communities, housing and local government, I asked what if somebody partnered with an area that was in the top 100, and that seems to be totally within this model. So I think a bit of local information and asking around your territories is relevant. So from those top 100 priority places, these are the 13 in Scotland, all led by the local authority in those areas. Yeah. So I can, at the end of this, if people haven't seen the prospectus, I'll put a link into the chat for this meeting. I know that it's been sent out by Ursa, and if you follow the prospectus, you can follow the link. You can see the 100 priority places. You can see these 13, and then you can see who they're envisaging would be the lead agents in each. Okay, so timelines. It's really tight, and I said, I think at the beginning, that even though they're talking about a year, in reality the delivery will be 6 to 9 months. So I think people need to bear that in mind. So the Community Renewal Prospectus has been published. We've got the list of priority places. The lead authorities are developing bids, and people are developing bids already. So my message to the sector is look at your local authority and find out who's developing things. There's going to be some capacity funding for the bids to get worked up, but of course that money will be going to the lead authorities. So 18th of June, which in this new world, I feel like 18th of June will soon be upon us. The lead authorities will submit their shortlist projects. So they go in, and from late July onwards, there'll be an announcement of the successful projects, and the first tranche of funding will start flowing through. We get to the end of the year, there'll be some midpoint monitoring reviews of the projects with the lead authorities, and 31st of March 2022, it's all done and dusted. And I said, does that mean then that that's when shared prosperity starts? And no official answer, but I suspect that is the case. And I think for anybody who's got existing European funding, there's a really strong case to be made for that getting extended to 2023 to make sure things are seamless. And obviously they're not going to pick up existing projects and automatically drop them into shared prosperity, but we don't want to lose the capacity and the capability within the sector. So there's an endless list of what they want, but these were the things that I thought were worth just pulling out and referencing this morning. So obviously, as always, tight deadlines, complete bids. but strong points about have to be delivered and all expenditure occurred by the 31st of March 2022. They need to respond to a need identified in the prospectus, which that sort of goes back to those first four, the skills, the employment, business, community. It mustn't duplicate any other national or local provision. I think we need to do a bit of teasing out of what that actually means. Doesn't conflict with national policy. I'm not sure how that could happen. And it's got to be delivered by legally constituted organisations, but that's where the local authorities come into it. So there isn't a require for match. However, I think it's alluded to, it's been said to me in a meeting that if people were leveraging other funds as opposed to match funding it, it will score higher. Yeah, but it's not a requirement. So I think if people aren't using other money, there's got to be a really strong case for a local project, and that's worth taking into consideration. So that's it. This is always that moment where I work out how the hell I get back to you guys and not my screen. I think I've nearly done it.
Right.
Okay, and I think that was a quick sort of ramble through, but it is worth saying that in my role at URSA, I have been able to talk, even yesterday, to the national UKSPF lead, who's told me what she's allowed to tell me. What she's not allowed to tell me, she's told me when she will be able to, which is always useful because, you know, you're not completely in the dark with it and you feel you know as much as there is out in the public domain. And the other thing to say is Paul was there and a colleague of Robin's was there when we went to the DWP round table with the 21 providers and we sent them the bullet points afterwards. That has been extremely well received. And I didn't know whether I had sort of pushed us into that meeting, you know, by not allowing them to say, no, we don't want to talk to you, if you know what I mean. But I think it's really pushed open the door and we're going to continue to feed information in through that door. So anything that comes up from discussions this morning, I do feel we have a sort of a route to influence. And I think it's worth saying that. And just one final thing, URSA co-chairs a coalition of other membership organisations with actually with the National Council for Voluntary Organisation, but people from SCVO have attended as well. And I think there's 40 organisations come together to look at the future of shared prosperity. So we've got sort of some of the big charities that cover the 4 nations. We've got some that are specific, and then we've got things like Association of Colleges and AELP, and we have Welsh Council for Voluntary Action, we have Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. Everybody's in there, and we're trying to identify the messages and the key things that we hold in common so that we don't go in with, you know, 20 different lobbies about it. So yeah, that's me done. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's getting clearer, but perhaps not getting as clear as we'd expected it to when we first started talking about Shared Prosperity Fund a few years ago. I mean, others will be more connected to the world of ESF and post-ESF than I am. It's a good number of years since I last ran an ESF funded programme. But just a couple of kind of quick questions or observations. Do we have a sense of what, at this particular stage, the scale of either, well, I'm presuming it's de-investment looks like, is the structural funds in this area come to an end and are replaced by this transition fund? Is it the same? Is it half? Is it 3/4? Because obviously, it's obviously going to have an impact in delivery organisations and the ability to achieve. Do we have a sense of what that magnitude is, or is that not clear?
The sense that I've got, and others may have heard different things, what I understand is that the UK government have committed to I was going to use the word match, but it's not a good word in this context. But anyway, just bear with me. They're going to commit to the same expenditure as came from Europe.
Okay.
But it's not the same expenditure as there was when you had the additionality.
Yeah.
When you did have the match. That's why match is a good word. There is a commitment to have UK money that's the same as the money that came from Europe, but whether local money is going to be added to it will vary from place to place.
Yeah.
Cumbersome answer, sorry, Paul.
No. I think the other, I suppose, question of observation is this incredibly short window for people to be pulling together projects and ideas, and again, if you look at the list of places that have been chosen, it fairly closely aligns with the city deal areas in Scotland, which, although those are funded both by the UK government and the Scottish government, they are predominantly, or they were originally funded by the UK government, and that does tend to fit with the pattern that we're seeing with things like the Towns Fund south of the border, where there are, relatively kind of, politically based decisions around where funding priorities are. I think 40 out of the 44 Towns Fund areas where kind of, Conservative marginal seats or recently won Conservative seats. So we are seeing, that happen perhaps a little bit more than it's happened in the past. Do we have, Robin? I'll maybe put you in the spot here because you're closer to this than I am. What's your best sense of where the ideas and where the projects are going to come from for this first wave? Is it going to be a race to kind of cram in suitable existing ESF funded projects into that? Is it going to be a bit dusting down the third and fourth choice city deal areas that weren't quite funded through that? Do you have a hunch on where that might go, Robin?
I can only really speak for brief conversations I've had with colleagues in North Lanarkshire, Paul, but I guess there's still, the devil's in the detail of this, and there's still a bit of kind of working through what can and can't be put into the pilots, because UK Shared Prosperity Fund is supposed to be the successor to ESF, but ESF is going to continue to run while these pilots run. And there's clear messages in the pilots that it shouldn't be duplicating existing activity. So therein we have a problem, before you even begin, because you're already doing what you're doing, and this fund is supposed to take over from what you're already doing, but you can't do what you're already doing in this fund. So there's some dynamics in there that we need to kind of work through. There's also, just even in the slides that Elizabeth had up there, it talks about the no duplication, it talks about the welcoming of match funding, and it also talks about enhanced and alignment with other provision. So if you're not duplicating and overlapping, but you want to bring in other provision, how does that work? Quite simply, what can you do? And I think the additional layer of complexity that gets thrown into this just now is the direction of travel from Scottish and local government towards no one left behind. So, everything is beginning to get pushed down the no one left behind route. There is the real drive to establish the local employability partnerships and have them as the vehicle through which all decisions are taken at a local level. But then the politics of this come into it, because it's being driven by the UK government. And if they want match funding in it, is the Scottish government prepared to use their money and their local authorities' money to match fund a national UK government initiative? So sorry, I've just raised a whole lot of questions there rather than answering your point, but I think that's the stage everybody's at. Everybody's just trying to grapple with the dynamics of it all just now.
Yeah. And I think it is. I mean, it's we've not got one thing ending and another thing beginning, and there are so many kind of complexities around influencing factors there that we won't really properly know, I suppose, until we find out who's won. I suppose. Is there anyone else got any kind of questions or thoughts or views that they want to come in with on UKSPF and how it might impact on your business or this area? Yep. Okay. Cool.
I think the final thing I would say, Paul, is despite just that 3 minutes of raising all those questions, I think it is to be welcomed that we're actually beginning to get towards the point where there is some information coming forward and the money is being committed, because I think it was about 2016, 2017 UK Shared Prosperity Fund was first muted, and it's probably taken us 3 or 4 years to even get a modicum of detail as to what this is going to look like. So, you know, I think despite all the challenges, it's certainly to be welcomed that money is beginning to appear and some details beginning to appear around what we can do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I think it's been a long time coming to get even to this stage, and it's very hard, I think, you know, to really fully properly appreciate and understand the impact of you know, structural funds over the last, you know, 30 or 40 years. I mean, I think the first programme I ever worked on in 1989 was ESF funded, and I've proceeded to work on them for about 20 years. And I think it's only when you strip all of these things out that you realise the bits that are left behind. So certainly some of those, you know, degrees of clarity around level of investment and beginning to see the first fruits of it come through is very positive. But, you know, I think there's a lot of challenge coming from the side here around, you know, the ability of government at various levels to align. And, you know, we're not really seeing across all of the actors at this point in time a huge amount of alignment of action and behaviour. And I think we're even seeing that today with some of the kind of political noises that are coming out. So it's going to be an interesting time to make sure it doesn't become a kind of, you know, competition of whose flag's on the project, which is kind of where it's going a bit at this point. So yeah. Okay, Elizabeth, thank you very much for that. I think that was really useful, and much more to come, I'm sure, on shared prosperity as we move forward. Okay, so moving on to the next agenda item. This is where we get technical, because I'm going to have to share my screen, and I don't think I've ever done this before in the world of Teams, so it could all go horribly wrong, or it might just be a breeze, I don't know. So hopefully you should see the Network of Networks final draft recommendations slide. So what we're going to do in this session is we're not going to go through everything in oodles of detail, because I think many of you will have been on the last call, or the last but one call, where Kate Still, our previous chair, went through all of this in quite a good bit of detail, where she talked about the origins of the Network of Network and went through the process of how we'd worked and how we'd got to this point in time. What I want to focus on really more than anything else is a quick recap of the Network of Networks and quickly move on to the recommendations, because we're now in a position where those recommendations have, by and large, it does say draft, but they have been agreed by each of these organisations that you can see in the screen. And what we want to do now, I suppose, is Employment Support Scotland. We want to have a plan for how we take forward this kind of piece of work, and how we push, you know, not just the whole piece of work, but the recommendations that chime with us as a group of employability organisations delivering in Scotland more, so that we can get the benefit of it, if that makes sense. So just by way of a quick recap, for those of you who don't know, not far after this time, probably about kind of late April, early May, when the ramifications of, you know, staying at home for more than a couple of weeks were beginning to kind of you know, bear down on us all, we'd started talking within ERSA and also within some of the other membership-based organisations around what might these, you know, fairly substantial changes and mean to the delivery of our services, the people that receive services, the ability of organisations to continue existing and delivering. And we kind of quickly realised that there was a much greater degree of benefit in us bringing together the network of these different membership-based organisations, and using the collective, you know, the collective insight and the collective resources to open up and have a series of conversations over the summer and try and come up with a coherent set of, if you like, kind of recommendations that we could all stand behind, bearing in mind that while we've got a lot of similarities, there are quite a lot of differences there in who the organisations represent. So just 5 networks, quite a lot of work over that period of time. We tried to be as open as we possibly could. We had active engagement from any organisation really that was part of TCEF, SUS, STF, SENSCOT and ERSA that wanted to be part of it. We had 3 separate work streams, and again, that was something that was agreed at the outset in terms of trying to limit and contain the focus of the work. So we looked at kind of youth and looked at alignment and integration alongside that. We focused on no one left behind, bearing in mind that that's a kind of key policy plank for the Scottish Government, and that, you know, nobody, you know, predicted that we would be in this position where we were likely to return to very, very high levels of kind of mainstream unemployment, and the very real risk there was that the people who we didn't want to leave behind through the No One Left Behind would be pushed further down the pecking order when it came to access to support and access to jobs and everything else. So we wanted to have a work stream on that. And when it was likely to be the case that there would be increased investment in programmes to try and combat and ameliorate the impact of the pandemic, and also to an extent on the withdrawal from the EU, how programmes were commissioned and how commissioners looked to maintain sufficient capacity and capability in their marketplaces, or communities of provider, or whatever you want to call it, was also something that was appropriate. So we had a work stream on commissioning and market stewardship. We had chairs for each of those work streams representing across the networks. I chaired the one on market stewardship and commissioning, and we, as you do with these things, set up terms of reference and kind of set out a work plan of how we sought to try and get to a point of bringing in kind of collaborative voices and coming to a point of conclusion. Most of the groups would have had some expert speakers and expert input, and that came from academics. It came from kind of recognised experts in the field. Some of the groups went to the extent of commissioning additional work to get qualitative and quantitative input from delivery organisations and others who have an interest in these areas to try and build a proper and better evidence base of what we think matters most and to support the recommendations. So a lot of good work over that period of time, a lot of shared endeavour, a lot of shared working from organisations that, while they share they share an arena and an area that they work within, we haven't traditionally been in a position where what are ostensibly membership-based organisations have come together and worked in this way. So just jumping through a couple of these, the key things that we wanted to kind of focus on in terms of making sure that the recommendations helped government navigate its way through it was about equity of opportunity, focusing on new and emerging skills. It was always likely to be the case that we see significant levels of displacement as the economy and society deals with the consequences of the pandemic, and we're already seeing very real changes to consumer behaviour and changes to kind of the availability of jobs and the way that jobs are structured and resourced as we come out of this. So we wanted to try and understand what that means, and again link it into some of the green priorities that both the Scottish Government and the UK Government have. Taking forward the preventative approach, we don't want to go right back to the beginning again. We want to try and make sure that prevention is key to this. Acting at pace and scale with clarity, I think, was incredibly important. We didn't have a year and a half to work this through. We wanted to make sure that commissioners were acting quickly. Proportionality was a theme that came through quite strongly, and we'll touch on that with the recommendations in a second. But it's evident to anyone that's worked in the employability landscape and related spaces over the last decade or so that the amount of money that government at all levels have spent on this has reduced as we've got to quote unquote near full employment, but still with a lot of people who are marginalised, a lot of people who are in poverty, in work and out of work poverty, and making sure that there's a proportionate solution to that, and also that governments and commissioners are evidence-based on their approach with the kind of the best focus and outcomes was also very important. So jumping straight in then, so we narrowed our recommendations down to a few key things. There is a wider set of papers associated with this which are available to be shared. Each of the three work streams come up with its own recommendations, and what this is that you're about to see here is the distilled down version of that, if you like. So these are the recommendations that each of the networks within the network of networks were able to say, yep, we agree with that. That makes sense to us and our members, and we're happy to endorse it. So there is a degree of rewording in here, and there are also some incredibly coherent and credible recommendations that were the recommendations of each of the individual work streams, but might not have made it into the final key recommendations. Not because they're not good or not coherent, but we wanted to try and come up with something that we could, if we managed to get in the lift with a minister, that's not going to happen anytime soon, clearly, that we would be able to rhyme off the 5 things or the 6 things, rather than having 3 pages, 5 pages, 10 pages of recommendations and allowing government to pick the easy ones without being too disrespectful on that front. So So key recommendations around alignment and integration, just very quickly go through these. An immediate need for strategic planning and investment. This whole issue of, how the policy areas and related spaces of things like justice and education and health and social care are better aligned to really make sure that people who are going through predominantly employment-led programmes are supported in the way that they could. I think there was a theme come out of all the groups, which is that, look, we have very linear approaches to dealing with individuals, and we have a kind of, almost a kind of time-based approach into how disadvantaged you need to be in order to access things. And we have, inadvertent walls that appear between services, and that for many people, particularly those who are more disadvantaged, means that they're getting access to one type of help and support, but they're in some cases being precluded from others. So having that at the heart of it was something that we wanted to be absolutely key. We also wanted the government to kind of act, or governments to act very quickly to say, look, we don't know what's going to happen, but what we're going to do is provide some surety to existing programmes and existing structures to say that while we work through all of this, that we're going to make sure that things stay in place for a period of time and that there's no likelihood of disruption or transition. In particular in Scotland, that included maintaining capacity and capability in programmes like Community Jobs Scotland, the National Third Sector Fund, the Employability Fund, Inspiring Scotland. And that some of the key stakeholders in that should retain their place and space. That was a kind of key recommendation. Young people in particular are a group that we all know that are already significantly impacted in this. The rates of unemployment amongst the youth group have shot through the roof. And we wanted to make sure that that there are some key and clear recommendations coming through in this around the plethora of job creation schemes and how we think they could work better so that they meet the challenges. So when this was done, which was late last year, we absolutely welcomed all the things that had come out, both from the UK government and the Scottish government, but we felt that there were some things that they needed to do, both to go further and provide more in the way of job creation schemes for young people to support those most vulnerable, but also to align these better. And in particular, we focused on the youth guarantee that came out of the Sandy Begbie review in Scotland, and also the Kickstart scheme that came out from the UK government. And we come up with some kind of clear recommendations on how those could potentially work better together, so that they're not competing with each other, and so that there's a degree of alignment. We focused in particular, I think, on how perhaps elements of the youth guarantee and the Kickstart scheme could work together to provide an extension to Kickstart, so that it isn't a 6-month programme, but a programme that lasts longer for those who are most disadvantaged, and or potentially looks to enhance the experience by paying the living wage. Those of you who've been in calls with me before will know that I'm a fairly kind of passionate advocate of the living wage, and my organisation is in the process of putting our Kickstart opportunities out there. We are taking the hit on it because we're a living wage employer. I don't see why people who are on a Kickstart placement should not be on the living wage just because it happens to be a different programme. So we sought out to make some suggestions on how those things could work together. Measurement and targets. So though this wasn't a specific work stream, it came up through pretty much every work stream. We wanted to make it very clear that at this time, when everything's turned upside down and when there's a lot of hard to predict impacts, that we wanted to make sure that access to programmes really needs to be quicker, easier and less bureaucratic, and that we should worry a lot less about the theory of double funding or the theory of someone being not quite eligible for the programme that the programme is designed for, and that we try and remove some of the administration that's associated alongside that around about onerous eligibility checks and paper-based processes. Anyone that's in a delivery organisation that's attempted to deliver paper-based processes during the pandemic, where employers are working from home and where individuals are less likely to be able to come in and put their signature in a document, will tell you that something that was already very laborious and very antiquated has just gone off the scale. So we really wanted the government to use this as an opportunity to focus the funding and the effort on the things that matter most. Yes, so this was the second part of that recommendation, and this was more coming through from those organisations working in the youth side of things. Directing support to what really works, working closely with Skills Development Scotland on the inclusion of providers in the 16+ data hub. There's within most of the landscapes that we operate in across Scotland, there's been a language and a rhetoric over the last, probably decade or so around data and around evidence base, and I think we've certainly seen some strong individual areas of progress in terms of actually using data to better inform delivery. But I would probably suggest that we're still quite far down the road in terms of being in a position where data is used to the fullest extent to best inform where delivery priorities should be, and also to evidence how programmes are actually working. So moving on to commissioning and procurement, which is the final area. So this is one where there are perhaps some things that particularly pertain to the direction of travel in Scotland. We had a key recommendation was that commissioning really needs to be fully independent in order to avoid any sense of a conflict of interest and to ensure that there's parity. As Robin touched on earlier on, there's an almost kind of unstoppable move towards the key principle of no one left behind, which is that funding and funding priorities are moving towards being decided at a local employability partnership level. And while local employability partnerships are, essentially slightly separate from local authorities, they are aligned to local authorities and they are heavily, driven by local authorities. And there is a significant level of concern coming through from STF members, I know, because I sit on the board of that organisation, and also from many employability-based organisations in TSEF and Employment Support Scotland, that this could and may lead to either services being in-housed by local authorities basically take over the delivery of the service, or where money, if you like, comes off the top of that in order to fund local infrastructures, and that we end up with a degree of a kind of postcode lottery across the piece. So while we're not attempting to reverse the principle and the underlying kind of ambitions behind No One Left Behind, there are some very real potential risks there around conflict and around the public sector acting as a commissioner and a provider, and the perhaps unfair advantage in some places that gives the in-house provider over the kind of independent organisation. One of the themes that come up very strongly during the conversations that I had with many colleagues around commissioning and market stewardship is that the number of organisations who actually are engaged in the delivery of employability and related services, not surprisingly, is a fraction of what it was 5 years ago, a fraction of what it was 10 years ago. And commissioners need to take cognizance of the capacity and the capability that they believe they need in their area, and match that to the ambitions that they have. It's all very well and good coming up with, we want provision in our area to look like A, B and C, but if you don't have that capability and capacity and you're not creating an environment where that can be nurtured and supported, then you're going to find it difficult to deliver that ambition. So we felt that was important. The second was that this was about size and scale, and this plays to that part that the procurement processes and everything that's connected in that have got to be proportionate to the policy intent, the outcomes and the scale of delivery. So this perhaps feeds back some experience that some organisations have had of perhaps overly onerous procurement processes that might be very disproportionate to the scale of delivery. It also plays to things like very short contract durations. We have a history, I think, in Scotland among the SDS programmes in particular of annualised procurement, where you might not find out if you've actually got the contract until 3 days before the end of March, and then you're expected to stand that up at the beginning of April. And all of these things apply a lot of downward pressure to not just organisations but the individuals that work in those organisations, to retaining talent in the sector. So there's a whole piece there around how commissioners, understand the responsibility that they have around how they procure things, the proportionality of that, how it achieves the outcomes and the policy intent, and also how it matches the scale of delivery. We use the term commissioners need to radically rethink the approach to procurement, because that's what we believe is needed. This isn't about a tweaking. This is something that needs to be really quite radical and longer term, so that it's not about kind of short-term objectives, but more about maintaining a longer term, better performing, more sustainable system overall. And the final point, I think, was around specialist support. So this is one that plays to all programmes, both at a UK-wide level and at a Scottish and at a regional and a local level, which is around the specialist support. And by that, I mean, things that are vital and crucial to individuals' ability to progress and to be in a position where moving into work and being in work is something that they can achieve. but something that isn't precisely in the mainstream employability sector. So that could be about support around addictions, it could be a support around basic skills, a whole range of areas out there. And there's been a tendency to include these in the envelope when you are procuring services and expect organisations to be able to deliver. In the session that we had some brilliant input from Andy Hurst from Cambridge Policy Consultants, and he was able to share some experience from other parts of the world on where they had tried this and tried it for a longer period of time perhaps than we have, and eventually come to the conclusion that really it's better to perhaps procure these things in a different way and separate to the procurement of the mainstream, if you like, outcome-based employability programmes, but that you build proper access to these services and you ensure that they're properly funded and that they work in a much more effective way. So we, collectively believe that that should be an approach that governments consider here, because it will provide a much better level of specialist support, a more consistent level of specialist support, and it will provide them with the level of funding that they actually need, rather than attempting to convert, elements of a payment by results model into something that doesn't operate in that level. So that is a whistle-stop tour. It might not feel like it. I've probably talked for longer than I intended to. There's a lot more to it than what's just been conveyed there. But what we wanted to do, I suppose, is to attempt to begin to have a bit of a conversation with some Employment Support Scotland members around, from us and from our point of view, is there anything glaring that's missing? And that can be a particular theme or a particular kind of challenge or set of recommendations, but it might also be what's emerged since this piece of work was done, bearing in mind that most of this was probably finalised in late December and things are shifting fairly quickly. But more importantly, going forward, what do we do with this? We've got an agreement between each of the networks on this being the final set of recommendations, but the taking it forward is a decision for each of the organisations. We are planning to continue to work together, but we're not bound in this is how we take it forward and we're having a launch event and it will always have to have the five of us tied together. It's really up to each of the networks to do with it what we will, and what we want to think about is that from an Employment Support Scotland perspective, and we're not going to nail it all today clearly, but what resonates most with us, what's missing, and what do we want to do with it going forward. So with that, I'll shut up and open up the conversation to anyone that wants to come in at that point in time. Okay, I have a hand up. Can I see who the hand is up by? Dougie.
Yeah. Hi there. Just following Teams etiquette at Scrutiny, you get shouted at if you don't use the hand. Thanks for that, and thanks Elizabeth previously. That's fascinating. I think for me, just with the amount of change, for us as a charity and as a national provider, you often go to the place of insecurity in terms of, okay, how are we going to look a year down the line? Right? And I think that's probably, I'm guessing the same for most of us. And the one thing which can be consistent, I suppose, in our thinking is that we simply want to have a space to trade in. And the biggest threat to that, aside from policy and change and local authority manoeuvres and whatnot, is the opportunity to tender, I suppose, because we can all network and engage. But I think there's a requirement, like a minimum service requirement around tender windows and the public procurement process, and how things are handled on PCS. So I think that's a really big one for us and the wider network of networks. And because it's not just about a decentralisation of funding and the disruption of ESF and EF going as well. It then goes to local authorities that it can become even more fragmented. And I think going hard on minimum timescales and proper engagement will also help the local authorities when it comes to treasury management and planning, and making money go further. Elizabeth's point previously on the CRF funding that's coming through. There's maybe a requirement for match, but we don't know. I mean, the dark arts of local authority tendering are known really well. If you've got additional money, it can help. So there's, I think, just giving us space and time is the big thing for me to allow us to engage, because already with the No One Left Behind agenda, there's a couple of, there's a few tenders out of frameworks. So I think Fife, was out and closed in a fortnight. you know, and South Lanarkshire, you know, popped up just a minute ago. So I think that is probably the main thing, just to throw in the 10 pence worth. There's something about the key metrics, because it's good enough saying we need to think about how we commission and whatnot, but I think it's about, well, we need space and time to properly manage it, and that probably also talks to your last point there about EF and announcement of funding, you know, and the annualised approach, and you know, in bigger organisations with bigger infrastructures, and even smaller ones, it's you know. Private or third sector, it doesn't really matter. You've got people that you need to pay, you've got mortgages, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are really valuable points, and I also had to kind of write in my day job capacity. You know, I had to kind of write to Fife Council and say, listen, thanks very much for giving me a place in your framework, but you know, and in 5 days, there's no way that I can kind of, you know, put a bid together, you know, for 7,500 words when I had no notice that I was going to have to do it. And I think, and I get why people are operating in that timeline, you know, that they have fixed, you know, they have fixed treasury points, but it's the recognition that what you're likely to get is imperfect solutions, far from perfect solutions, actually, if you push it in that basis. And the bigger thing overall on that, and this is the thing that's always kind of, you know, massively frustrated me, and you know, in the skills development Scotland space, as someone that sits in the STF board, is there's a kind of tacit acceptance of, like, well, you know, it's annual procurement, you know, what can you do? And I thought, well, you know, it seems ridiculous that in an environment where what you're really striving to achieve is to get as many people as you possibly can into a position where they're in secure, well-paid employment that allows them to be as independent as they can be and not at the mercy of the benefit system, and be able to thrive and survive, and get all of the nice things that being in a good job gives people around security. Yet the very people who are doing that are operating at best on a year-to-year basis. Crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And I think that, you know, there will always be, you know, the reason this is the case is because of X, Y, and Z. But it's one of those things that, you know, that somebody, you know, a high enough level just needs to take a stand on and say, well, look, that isn't acceptable. It's not acceptable that that's the case. Sorry, Dougie, you're on mute.
So the timescales for procurement and the annualised procurement process actually is incongruent with what the policy themes of No One Left Behind stand for. So if they're looking for greater collaboration and integration and joint working, I think in layperson's terms, if you've got 5 days or 5 weeks you're to tender for something, it's going to drive behaviour. So just because we're speaking, can Street League and Triage work together on a new fund? If it's 5 days, we're not going to be picking up the phone to each other. You know, but if it's 5 weeks, that's a phone call to have a look at it, and then that would drive more revenue into a said authority on a said issue. And if we've got match funding, that could be even more. So I think, again, when it comes to a lobby, I think often people on the government side or the public sector side who hear things often hear our space, you know, have an issue and whatnot. But I think the tactics around this is actually trying to deliver what the policy is trying to deliver, and saying, if you want this, then you need to consider these things in order for us to meet that demand, as opposed to, you know, you're not a Mona, Paul, because, you know, we know each other, right? But I think how the news is received can be very articulate. It can be articulated well in an academic way, which is a sensible thing. And I think that serves all of the providers in our space.
Yeah. So do we think there's a specific community, you know, one of the things we'll have to work through is that we've got a bunch of, you know, what are relatively well crafted and well formed recommendations, but they are a work of compromise to some extent, you know, because they've come from a number of different places. And I think one of the things that, again, we're not necessarily going to do it today, but we need to do it fairly soon, is identify the ones that are most coherent and matter most to us and most timely at this point in time. So, you know, with that in mind, is there something that we want to sharpen up around, you know, the recommendation, the recommendations that are closer to this space and time thing, and actually kind of bring that to life a little bit more as a, listen, you know, you're in a position where you're starting to commission programmes. This is the minimum window of opportunity you need to give in order to be congruent with your policy aims and objectives. Is that the type of thing that we would want to do you think, Dougie?
Very definitely, yeah. I mean, there's also some simple things like, I mean, we can go right down a rabbit hole here on this, but the commissioning process, what might happen as we see change driving forward is that every organisation needs to start from scratch in a commissioning process. If you think about the preferred provision or preferred provider status, there could be a national, it's not about data sharing, but a national procurement hub that gets organised around policy and change, where local authorities can properly engage, even with organisations they don't know. When we're talking about specialist provision, and kind of niche type work, as opposed to it's about reducing cost and saving time. But that's kind of granular. But that type of thing, just allowing us to properly engage to create business and opportunities.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. Robin.
Well, I just wonder if, there is an opportunity, because just picking up on Dougie's point about, the time pressures, I think it was a couple of meetings ago where David Iser from Fraser of Allender Institute did an input, and I noticed subsequent to that David's done a couple of pieces, and one of the pieces is about the fact that there is a technical issue around a Scotland-specific economic shock has occurred, and it's I won't attempt to go into the detail of it, but it's as a result of timing of GDP figures at a UK and a Scottish level. But what it actually does is it gives additional budget flexibilities to the Scottish Government to roll monies from one year into the next for a period of, I understand, 3 years now. Okay. And it was part of the devolution settlement, and it was, again, one of these unintended consequences, I think, and it is just a factor of timing between the UK and the Scottish figures coming out. But my understanding, having read a couple of bits from David, is there's now the ability for the government to move money from 1 year to the next for a period of up to 3 years. So that should act in favour of just taking a bit of a deep breath and thinking about what we want to do, because I think a lot of the pressures we're faced just now is around additional consequentials have come from the UK government to the Scottish government, but in usual government fashion, they've got to be spent by the end of the financial year, and that's why we've all been harassed and harried into coming up with some weird and wonderful ideas that we can implement tomorrow and have done by next week. So, I think maybe having a little bit of a look at that. As I say, I'm not an expert, but I have read a couple of the things from David, so there may be something in there that backs up this argument.
Yeah, and I think that connects a little bit, to the ability and the desire of government at appropriate levels to just challenge some of these conventions. Obviously, that's a Scottish government to a UK government, one that is, from what I understand you're saying, is kind of governed by obviously these unpredicted factors around GDP. But if you take that down a level, there are, if you get back to the whole rush to the end of the financial year thing that happens, that doesn't need to happen. That's a consequence of people's adherence to a particular rule that they could actually just challenge a little bit. And likewise, the perennial one that we talk about with our friends at SDS is that we know that they've got we know that there's a kind of issue of signing off the budget each year, but they've signed it off every year, and I think they then have big, which I still don't understand, having dealt with it for about 4 years now, this whole issue of contingent liability from a programme from 1 year into the next. They're already signing that off anyway. But what they're not doing is giving you a contract over that period of time and giving you the ability to make, to forward plan and to give staff the security they need to have, and all of these types of things. It's the unintended consequences of how government acts that they probably should think about changing. What else? Anything else that anyone wants to come in on any of the recommendations, whether they agree with them or disagree with them, or it's all a bit fudged and doesn't sound as clear as it could be? Any other thoughts and views from anyone?
Paul, can I just come in? Yeah, I mean, obviously we're going to try and land our messages in the obvious places, with Scottish Government, with John Farrow, with talk to colleagues at COSLA and at the other organisations that collaborate in the network of network. But if there's anybody that comes to mind, either now or later, where you think it'd be really good if URSA landed our recommendations in their inbox, will you let us know? And the easiest way to do that is if you email policy@ursa.org.uk, because then Callum and I'll pick it up, make sure that one of us, probably me, does that. So that's just a sort of an appeal that, you know, the more you help us, the better our messaging can be.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Elizabeth. Dougie.
Yeah, don't want to screen hog here, but just in the back of Robin's point and Elizabeth's point there, which kind of meet. The Scottish Youth Guarantee has been driven by Sandy Begbie. Some of us on the call may have met or know Sandy. And obviously there's the recommendations from his initial report, and one of the recommendations talks about the stability of the current infrastructure and that being maintained for 2 years. And, you know, as with these consultancy processes, what happens, there's a big market around it, and then there's a lot of weight behind it, and then sometimes it kind of loses a bit of momentum as things move along. The Youth Guarantee is obviously something that government are right behind, and I think what we're talking about should definitely be filtered into Sandy, because you would assume that he is very close and has a lot of influence to the decision makers, and that would be quite a sophisticated way for us as a group to not lobby, but, you know, influence, but definitely Sandy. And I think he has got a keen ear on the Youth Guarantee group. I think that I can hold my water on that, but I think there's a lot of voices with about a lot of individual things that are put forward, and I think what they're looking for with the guarantee is big things which make sense, which connect together. The fact that we, you know, a major part of the infrastructure, you'd certainly, I think, listen to what we've got to say.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely something we should look to do. You know, I think that one of the benefits that you get, I suppose, of having, you know, networks, or if you have delivery-based organisations, you know, we you know, many of us will be involved in some of these conversations, others not, but you may have an understanding of what the intent is and how the conversation is going and what the objectives and the principles are. But if you then take a step back and, you know, I mean, my organisation is not a predominantly youth-based organisation, although we do a lot of work to support young people. But if I talk to 2 or 3 peers and say to them, so how is that kind of, you know, assurance that the infrastructure has been maintained because of the, you know, the Youth Guarantee? We're kind of left scratching our heads. We don't really know. You know, we're not seeing anything coming out around programmes lasting longer or streams of funding being kind of guaranteed for a period of time that gives you an opportunity to bid for things. You know, being quite candid, it kind of looks like it's a big part of it at the moment is about businesses committing to it. But it kind of looks a bit like this, you know, what the Scottish Business Pledge was when it came out, that you're making a series of commitments that are, to all intents and purposes, relatively easy to make, but it doesn't then lead to tangible, you know, security or tangible outcomes or outputs. So, but again, some of you guys might be closer to that. You might be able to say that, well, for my organisation, I can now see that X, Y, and Z are likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 to 9 months as a consequence of the Youth Guarantee. Yeah. But I can't see anything on that front at all.
So the Youth Guarantee is a, I don't even know what the appropriate word is. It's a concept.
It's a concept. Yes.
Yeah, and right now what's happening is they're looking at how to properly measure it. So next week the working group is looking at their shared measurement framework, and my point here connects to the fact that they're looking to provide their organisations. They're going to be counting organisations like ourselves and our outputs towards the Youth Guarantee. So, you know, we've got legitimacy in that we create a difference in terms of putting people into work or, you know, supporting the skills agenda. So we, in a way, we provide an answer. And yeah, I think there's a crossover there which could be useful for us pushing our points. That's all. Yeah. As a suggestion.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that, Dougie. Any other comments or observations, or is there anything missing that anyone sees? I know that it might not be that easy to jump in at this point in time, but nope. Okay. So Elizabeth, Robin, I think we do probably need to pick this up again separately, because what we don't want to do is wait to the next session on this, and it may well be that what we want to do is put a call out to the wider network and perhaps get some interested voices that want to just bring this conversation together for us and decide how we want to use this, because there is I mean, every can's getting kicked down the road at this point in time. I think we wouldn't have thought, last November that furlough would still be kind of, on the cards until September next year, and that to some extent delays the potential economic shock the longer that things like furlough carry on. But there are each month that passes, we're missing another window of opportunity, I think, to influence. And I think, being able to distill down in a very sharp sense, what does this tell us? What are the things that chime most, or how are we going to take it forward and with whom? I think that's something that we really want to have a plan on, really, in the next month, if not earlier than that. So if we could take that as an action, that'd be great. Robin.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I would agree. I think, there was a huge amount of work done by a lot of people around this stuff, and my own sense is, and it might be wrong, is we've kind of got within sight of the finishing line and then ran out of energy, and we haven't got that over the finishing line, and I think we're doing ourselves a major disservice in not taking it over the finish line. And I know we've had some kind of informal discussions with government, but we shouldn't underestimate some of the stuff that's in the report that is already beginning to feed through into policy. But the danger is, if we don't present that formally to government very quickly, it will just seem as though we are following in their wake. We're telling them something they're already doing, because, there's a couple of bits in the presentation there, Paul, recommendation 1A.2 around leadership and named responsibility. I was on a ministerial roundtable discussion yesterday about No One Left Behind, and that was a bullet point. It was about leadership and named responsibility. So they've already picked up from our recommendations, which we've talked to them informally about, but we haven't presented formally, and it's now their idea. So we're kind of trailing a bit in their wake. Similarly, the recommendation around Kickstart and YPG integration. I don't know if everybody got this, but there was also a shared communique came out yesterday from the Minister and from Councillor Parry on behalf of COSLA. And there's a specific sentence in it that says we will also provide additional wraparound support to the UK government's Kickstart programme through the delivery of the Young Persons Guarantee. So there's another thing we've been advocating. They have now committed to, but we haven't formally put it in front of them. So I think there's a real danger that, all of the work that we did won't be fully recognised unless we have some formal engagement with government and presentation to government on some of this stuff.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so let's take that forward and try and get a conversation in for next week if we can.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. So I think that probably moves us on to the second last, if not the last, agenda point, which is around what we choose to do going forward. We've got forums set up every couple of months, I think, between now and the end of the year. We've got dates in for the whole year, so the next one should be in May, I would imagine. I'm sure I've got the date in my calendar somewhere, but I've not got it open at the moment. So what from anyone, what are the types of things that you think we should be doing going forward? I mean, obviously we're probably even being optimistic, 2 or 3 ESS meetings away from being able to meet in person, I would suggest, and great though that will be to eventually get there. What do we think we can do to use the time best and to make it a more useful forum? We've obviously had some expert speakers over the course of the last while. We've had some input from government, both at a Scottish level and a UK level, getting a sense of what people want, both from this group here and also for the wider membership, will make it easier for us to hopefully make the Employment Support Scotland forum a better forum and a more engaging forum and a more useful forum for people. So are there any kind of initial thoughts and observations on what we should be doing more of or doing less of? Dougie?
So, I mean, the kind of waxing lyrical, see the point about the Fraser Allender Institute and how influential they are. Robin's picked up a gem there. Why can't we do something with them? In terms of like publications, a view from the field or just something. Doesn't matter what the concept is, but it strengthens our legitimacy so like a publication. And even if it's a paid piece of consultation work, I'm sure there's people that would like to contribute or could contribute to that, or even, the coffers might cover it. But so there's that, that intertwined with, I think, doing what's already happening. When we had Joanne Farrell speaking previously, there's a certain psychology about that last session where I think they were on their toes a wee bit. And I know we got a few platitudes, but you would expect that. But if you create a regular cadence where they feel as though they have to and are due a communication to this forum, it creates a bit of an umbilical cord and a responsibility, which is, it's a different approach. So continually inviting, asking them to speak, give us the update and giving them their place. But that's a soft way of getting our voice across. So those two things.
Yeah,
Suggest.
I agree, definitely. And beyond Fraser Vallider Institute, because I think that is a good call. I mean, it's about how you find ways of aligning our kind of input and the value that we can bring, as a wider group of a fairly wide and diverse group of delivery organisations to what they do. Is there anyone else that springs to mind in terms of influential voices, people that we would want to work with, but also people that would be interested in coming and getting input and getting, delivering views and getting input from our members? Robin.
Thanks, Paul. Sorry, I promise this will be my last contribution and give other people a chance to comment. But one of the things that is becoming clear to me is, and you made reference to it yourself earlier on, Paul, is the importance of the LEPs moving forward.
Yeah.
And on the call I was on yesterday, and incidentally, I'll send you a copy of that joint communique, Elizabeth, and you can circulate it round. But on the call I was on yesterday, there was mention of the improvement service in the shape of Pamela Smith doing an exercise around a self-assessment of LEPs. So each LEP has to undertake a self-assessment and feed that back into the improvement service, for then an exercise to take place about how they can try and bring some sort of standardisation to LEPs. Now, there's no desire to have them, 32 replicas of each other, but there's a recognition that some LEPs are reasonably well effective and other LEPs are entirely non-existent. They exist by name only. So I wonder if getting Pamela Smith along might be quite far out for that, but whether we could have a particular session from Pamela on the work that they're doing around LEPs, because obviously as the the service provider network, we would have a lot to say about that. So an approach to Pamela to do a specific session around the work that they're doing with LEPs might be useful.
Yeah, that would be.
And I'm definitely going to shut up now.
Yeah. No, I think that's really useful, and I think that is a good call, Robin. I think there's a tendency sometimes for the likes of for people like Pamela and from organisations like that to do some engagement, but the engagement might go as far as TCEF, but it might not quite reach Scottish Training Federation. Again, because I sit on that group, they have all of their engagement via SDS, which means that they're missing out on a number of things. But again, we have a lot of members that might not necessarily be part of TCEF, and actually having a wider conversation would be helpful. And I think the thing that's from having conversations with some officials in the Scottish Government, there is a very real recognition that there's diversity of strength in the LEPs, and clearly this is a way of addressing that or beginning to understand what might need to happen to level that out. But there's a point in time that's not that far down the horizon. A year from now, each of these LEPs is likely to take over responsibility for an additional 20 million, 25 million pounds worth of funding for programmes that are delivered by 40, 50 organisations. My organisation delivers, from a selfish perspective, we deliver across 12 local authority areas. I couldn't tell you the name of any of the LEP leaders because we have no engagement with them, because we haven't had to up until this point in time, and likewise they've had no engagement with us. So there's quite a lot. It could be my organisation's the exception rather than the rule, but there's a lot to do, I think, in terms of ensuring that transition takes place. And Dougie and I have spoken in the past about this, but one of the really poor consequences of not making that happen well is that there are hundreds, high hundreds of people who are delivering employability programmes in Scotland that are due to come to an end next March. you know, unless there's a way of ensuring that there's a degree of alignment between that current delivery infrastructure and what follows with no one left behind, then there's a good few hundred people who are likely to be made redundant at that point in time, which is a lot of talent to be lost, it has to be said. So I think we do need to take that one forward. Yeah, that's a good call. Anything else from anyone in terms of other things that we would want to be doing? So to see, sorry. That's Laura's just sent out in the chat, for those of you who haven't already seen it, confirmation of the next meeting, which is the 7th of May, and also the registration form on Eventbrite for it. So feel free to circulate that. Okay, so I think what we might want to do is, I mean, there's a good, you know, 4 or 5 suggestions there, I think, which we can take offline and progress for the May session, and also perhaps for the July one. And we'll probably look to do some engagement with the wider membership on some of the other things that we might want to do. But certainly getting in the recurring invites to the to Joanne and various others. They're always happy to come along. Of course they are. I think it's useful for them as well, but making sure that we've got them penciled in so that they're thinking about it a bit in advance of that, and they know that they're due to come back and see us, I think would be helpful, so we can pick that up too. Okay. Before we wind up, Elizabeth, is there anything that you want to be conveying and promoting from an ERSA perspective? Obviously, we've got a lot going on at the moment with the various platforms that we're developing, and we're obviously kind of trying to capture up-to-date information on all of our members. Anything else you want to kind of do the ERSA sales pitch on?
I just think I'll just take the opportunity for one, and that is the new ERSA website. It is so close to being live. We just have to keep doing those final tweaks. I feel like I keep telling people it's ready and it's not. But it's going to be perfect, and it's really good. It's interactive. It's got a member space, and we can have there's a space in it for interaction between members in Scotland. So there's the geography space. There's a collaboration with other organisations delivering similar contracts, you know, whether it's around youth, older workers, whatever. So yeah, we will make sure we showcase it at the next meeting, but just watch out for that announcement.
Great.
And everything else comes out in the bulletins. Just read the bulletins.
Yeah, excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So if there's nothing else, it's just for me to thank everyone for their time today, and we'll see you all at the next meeting, hopefully in May. And thank you to Phil for coming along. That was really useful.
Thanks, Phil.
And have a great day, everyone. Take care. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.